Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Miss Lorette and I'm going to continue walking us through section 3.3 in this video. In this lesson, we're going to continue solving multi-step equations that have variables on one side. And in this particular lesson, we're going to look at examples that have decimals. So you'll want something to write with, something to write on, and possibly a calculator. Any basic 10-digit calculator will do fine here. You don't need anything special. So go ahead and take a moment to copy this first example in your notes. Again, feel free to pause or rewind if you need more time to do that. And if you're someone who, needs that visual, so that way you're separating the equation into two sides, you can always draw your line down the equal sign like this. Now remember that when we're solving any type of multi-step equation, the first thing that we do in general is simplify as much as possible, and then we solve. And in solving, we're isolating the variable using inverse operations. When we're simplifying, the first thing that we look for are parentheses. If we see parentheses, we must distribute first. If we take care of the distributive property, or if we don't have to distribute, we then look to see if we have any terms to combine. So step 2 would be to combine like terms. And once we've taken care of all distributing or combining any like terms as necessary, we're then ready to solve. It's either going to be a 1 or 2-step equation at that point. The first thing that we look for when we're solving an equation is, do we have a constant? If we have a constant, we undo the constant first by adding or subtracting. So if we see a constant being added to the variable, we do the opposite and we subtract it, and vice versa. The last thing that we check for solving is, do we have a coefficient? That's a number being multiplied or divided with the variable. So we're going to undo the coefficient, coefficient, and we do so by multiplying or dividing. And again, whatever operation we see happening with the variable, we do the opposite. So if a number is being multiplied with the variable, we do the opposite and we divide. So looking at this equation, I have m minus 3.6 minus 3.3. And remember, this is really a 1m right here. Okay, so you may want to write that in just as a reminder. I'm not going to for right now. Looking at this equation, I see a variable term, a constant, and a constant. So remember, when we're combining like terms, we're looking for terms that have the same variable factors. So if it has a variable, if it has an m, it can only be subtracted or added with things that have an m. If it's a constant, a number by itself, it can only be added or subtracted with other constants. So since both of these negative numbers are constants, I can combine them. The m is just going to come down for the ride, and you can use your calculator for this step. Negative 3.6 minus 3.3, if you type it in correctly, should give you a negative 6.9. Just remember that depending on the type of calculator you have may determine how you type these negatives. Most calculators will actually have a separate button for the negative button versus the subtraction button. So if you're typing this first number in, this actually has to be typed in as a negative, not a minus sign. And then the second subtraction is actually a minus sign. It's the operation minus sign. So just kind of keep that in mind. Be careful how you're typing in your negatives. And I'm just going to bring down that equals negative 9.9. Okay, so it doesn't look like I have anything to distribute or combine. I've taken care of my simplifying steps, so now I look for a constant to undo. Negative 6.9 is not touching the variable, so I know it's a constant. It's being subtracted, so I do the opposite and I add. And what I do to one side, I must do to the other. These are going to cancel on the left, and I'm left with m. And if I use my calculator here, again, careful how you type it in, negative 9.9, you got to type that negative, not a minus sign. Okay, For most calculators, there are two different buttons. And then you're going to type plus 6.9, and I get an integer of -3. So not everything is going to give us a decimal, even though we started with decimals. Kind of like how when we work with fractions, not everything's going to work out as a fraction answer. Let's take a look at another one. Here we go. Okay, so again, take a moment to copy, maybe draw a line down your equal sign, and you may even want to recopy the steps over again, or just refer to where you wrote them before. The first step when we're solving any multi-step is to look for parentheses. I do have parentheses here. That means I need to distribute. So that means I need to take this 4, the number touching the parentheses, and multiply it with each of these inside numbers. Again, I'm just going to use my calculator here. 4 times 3.5 gives me 14. Just remember, this product should have an x attached to it. 4 times 2, I can actually do that in my head. That's going to give me a positive 8. And I bring down my equals, -45.2. Now I look for any terms that can be combined. Well, if I look on the left side, this has an x, this does not. So they're not like terms. This is a variable term and this is a constant. So I'm ready to solve. To solve, I look for a constant first if I need to undo it. My 8 is my constant. I know it's the constant because it's not attached to a variable. So to undo a constant, we either add or subtract. Since the 8 was positive, I do the opposite and I subtract. On the left, I still have a 14x. And on the right, again, I can just type it into my calculator. The negative has to be typed before the 45.2 and then -8. And when I do that, my calculator is going to know to add the two numbers because they were both negatives. They were the same sign. And it also knows to tell me that that sum should be a negative number. The last thing I need to get rid of is this 14, which is touching my variable. A number touching a variable means they're being multiplied. The inverse of multiplication is to divide. What I do to one side, I must do to the other. And if I just divide that -53.2 by 14, I should get a -3.8. Again, just remember, you want to type that negative before you type that number. You should be getting a negative quotient here. Let's take a look at another one. So a little bit harder still. So go ahead, take a moment to copy it down. Again, let's draw our line down. You don't have to do this, but it's a nice visual. And the first thing we look for are parentheses. I see parentheses, so I must distribute first. I cannot combine like terms first. I cannot try and solve anything here. I have to distribute first. So I'm going to take this 3, which is touching the parentheses, and I'm only going to multiply it with the terms inside the parentheses. I don't multiply it with this number out here. This number on the end is just going to come down for the ride for our next step. So I'm going to bring down this 33.6 equals 3 times -2.6. I'm just using my calculator here. It's giving me a -7.8x. Don't forget that that number had an x, so my answer here should also have an x. 3 times -0.6. Careful with that next product. That 0.6 is a negative. 3 times -0.6 gives me a -1.8. So I got to make sure to bring down that minus sign that I got when I multiplied. And then this -2.8x is just coming down for the ride because we didn't distribute to it yet, or at all, because we're not supposed to. It's not in the parentheses. Okay, so the next thing I want to do now that I've taken care of that first step is to look to see if I have any like terms. This term has an x. This term does not, so it's a constant. and this term has an x. I have two variable terms. Because I've got two variable terms, I want to combine them. Now keep in mind they're both negatives. So if you're doing this in your calculator, you got to type this first number as a negative 7.8 and then this one as a minus 2.8. On my calculator, the negative and the minus operation are two different buttons. And when I do that, that's giving me a negative 10.6. And don't forget, it's got a variable on it. This minus 1.8, which was our constant, didn't get combined with anything, so it's just going to come down for the ride, as well as this number on the left. And at this point, I should have taken care of all of my simplifying steps. I can now solve. When we're solving, we look to see if we have a constant first. The constant is the number that's not touching the variable. I undo it by adding or subtracting. Since it's negative, I add it. What I do to one side, I must do to the other. And again, I can just use my calculator. I have to type this 33.6 as a negative first, and then plus 1.8, and that gives me a negative 31.8. I bring down that negative 10.6x. Again, this number, which is touching the variable, that means multiplication. So I want to do the inverse and divide both sides by negative 10.6. Notice when we multiply or divide, we don't change the sign in our operation. So if that 10.6 was a negative, we divide by a negative as well. And in my calculator, I can just work this out. Just keep in mind when you're dividing here, you're not going to type the minus operation. You're actually going to type the negative symbol for both of them. Hopefully that's clear with what I'm trying to say. We don't want to hit minus as if we're subtracting. These are negatives, the way that I have to type it in my calculator. And when I do that, it gives me a positive quotient of 3. Okay, and that's pretty much how to work with multi-step equations with decimals in a nutshell. There are a couple of examples here for you to try on your own, so feel free to pause the video at this point, give them a go, and when you unpause, you'll see some solutions. Okay, so here's what you should have gotten as your answers. For number 1, you just have to remember that in front of these two variables, there's really invisible ones. So we've got a -1 and another -1, and they're both variable terms, so we can combine them to get a -2. From this point forward, it's a two-step. We want to undo this negative constant first. This is a -3.2. To undo it, we add it to both sides, and then from there we bring down the -2. Don't forget about this negative sign. And this is being multiplied with the variable, so the opposite would be to divide. You should have gotten 3.25 equals n, and it should be a positive answer. Number 2, we have parentheses here, so we have to start by distributing. Take this -3, multiply it to each of the inside numbers. -3 times 1.7 will give you -5.1. -3 times -2.9, because it is a negative, be careful. Two negatives when I multiply give me a positive, and I get 8.7 as my product. This should have an x on it since the first number up here had an x. From here, it's a two-step equation. I don't have any like terms to combine. I'm going to undo this negative constant first by adding it to both sides. Using my calculator, that gave me a -26.1. I brought down my 8.7x, and then this number, which is touching the variable, means multiplication, so the opposite would be to divide both sides by 8.7. Doing this in my calculator, I got a -3 as a final answer. I hope that you found all of these examples helpful. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out either to me or to your math teacher if you're in a different class, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.